Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial. Today, we've got another video in our battle series. We're going back and we're talking about the pivotal Battle of the Coral Sea. Maybe one of the most historically significant battles in history. It's not necessarily a decisive battle by any means, but it's the first time that aircraft carriers fight each other and surface ships never see each other throughout a naval battle. We've previously talked about Coral Sea, Midway, and some other battles all grouped up into one older video, so this is something of a remake. Today's video will be dedicated just to the Coral Sea. Stay tuned for a future video on the Battle of Midway, which will probably release on the anniversary of the battle, June 4th. The Battle of the Coral Sea was fought in early May of 1942. It was concluded by about May 8th, and at that point, Japanese and American forces retreat from the battle. So, let's look at it. The strategic position in the Pacific, Japan has an unbroken streak of wins. They have attacked basically in all directions. Japan, which is pretty north and west in the Pacific, attacked Pearl Harbor, and then was able to take U.S., British, French, Dutch, basically anybody's colonies in the Pacific, whether they were east or south of them. And they had multiple fleets going out in multiple directions. And the Kido Butai, their carrier strike force, which at times was made up of 6 fleet carriers, was running back and forth from Pearl Harbor to the Western Pacific to the Indian Ocean. They attack Port Darwin. They're all over the place. And nothing the Allies do can stop them. Throw combined fleets together with ABDA, and that gets sunk. The Dutch East Indies fall. The British send some battleships and carriers into the Indian Ocean, and the Japanese carriers destroy which ships they're able to get to engage, but otherwise they retreat. A British battleship and battle cruiser are sunk early in the war by Japanese aircraft. These guys are undefeated. So, the United States had a line of islands from the U.S. to Hawaii, Midway, Wake, Guam, to the Philippines that was like a knife pointed at Japan's chest. They could refuel, resupply, and use air cover along this string of islands to get all the way to Japan's back door. So one of Japan's earliest missions in the war was to take those islands and create a ring of defensive barriers. And Japan was able to create a ring of islands 3 or 4 layers deep. Meanwhile, the United States was also scrambling to create a ring of defenses between themselves and the West Coast. So you had the US West Coast, you had Hawaii, and then there was a ring of islands which they had managed to defend from the Aleutians in the north through Midway and all the way down to American Samoa in the south, going through Johnston Atoll and the Line Islands. And so the U.S. sort of fortified along this line. The Japanese fortified along their own line. And both sides start launching air attacks against the others. America's earliest attacks against the Japanese are using their carriers to go across into the Japanese mandate and attack them there. The Allies have a huge base in the continent of Australia to the south of Japan's island defenses. Australia basically anchors the southern flank of the Allied position. So the Japanese are looking to move into the South Pacific to further bolster their defenses. And in May of 1942, they're looking at going into the Australian mandate of Papua, which is part of New Guinea. And they are looking at going into Tulagi in the northern end of the Solomon Islands. And if they can move through these areas, they can effectively cut Australia off from the rest of the Allies and isolate them and prevent them from being an anchor to the Allied line or a major base. So that's what the Japanese are trying to do, and that's what the Americans are trying to prevent. So the Americans send Yorktown to the Coral Sea area around Australia to launch some attacks. The Japanese are aware of these attacks, so the commander on the Japanese side in that area requests that Japanese air support is sent to him. So Admiral Yamamoto is in the middle of planning the Midway operation. This is going to be the big battle to get all the American carriers in one place and sink them outright. He's designing this battle because of the Doolittle raid launched on Tokyo. Sort of leaves him with egg on his face, so he's got to deal with these American carriers now. He has to lure them into a battle. He decides that, correctly, decides that Midway is a critical enough base that if he attacks it, the American carriers will come out and he'll get the chance to destroy them. However, the Japanese are expanding in all directions simultaneously, and that's going to be a huge problem with the Midway operation. We'll cover that in the next video, but it's a huge problem for this because he takes 1/3 of the fleet carriers he has assigned to attack Midway and sends them into the South Pacific. And in theory, they can go down there, provide air support, and come back in time for Midway. In practice, if they get into any sort of trouble, if things are delayed at all, or if, God forbid, they suffer any sort of damage, he loses them for this major operation. You're never supposed to divide your forces, especially in the face of the enemy. Yamamoto doesn't have a complete picture of the American side of things, so he doesn't know he's dividing his forces in the face of the enemy, but he is absolutely dividing his forces, and it'll do him dirty here, and it'll really do the Empire wrong at Midway. So, his two most modern carriers, Shokaku and Zuikaku, which are also the least trained of the Kido Butai carriers, but in my opinion, the very, very best aircraft carriers in the world, with some of the very best carrier aircraft and probably the best pilots in the world. The only pilots better than Shokaku and Zuikaku's were the ones on Akagi and Kaga and Soryu and Hiryu. Otherwise, these are the two best designed carriers in the world in 1942, some of the best carrier aircraft and pilots. The Americans have broken the Japanese code. They know that these carriers are being dispatched there. So Nimitz decides to concentrate all 4 of his available carriers. Yorktown is already there, and Lexington is on her way. Saratoga, his 5th carrier, is still undergoing repairs. That ship can't leave port without getting hit by something. And Enterprise and Hornet, under the command of Admiral Halsey, have just gotten back from the Doolittle raid. So they're still a couple of days out from the Coral Sea, but he dispatches them immediately from Hawaii so that all of his available carriers are going to concentrate in the South Pacific, and they can repulse this invasion, keep the lines to Australia open, and maybe knock out a small part of the Japanese fleet and make it a little bit more even. At this point, Japan has at least 10 aircraft carriers, and the United States in the Pacific has those 4 I just mentioned, plus 1 damaged. So knocking out 2 starts to even the odds a little bit. The Japanese start the first part of their operation landing troops in the Solomon Islands, particularly on Tulagi, where they're setting up a float plane base. Yorktown, which is still the only one in the area under the command of Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, who will again command at Midway, is the overall flagship of the U.S. forces and is the first one in the area. They're able to launch an attack and do some damage, but they can't prevent the Japanese from making the landing. And the Japanese will get the float plane base up and ready by May 6th. So the Japanese now know 100% there are American carriers in the area, and Admiral Tanaka, commanding the Japanese carriers, is alerted and begins to prepare to cover the invasion forces. The Allies have 3 task forces. They have Admiral Crace, who's a British admiral, his force, which consists of 2 Australian cruisers, heavy cruiser Australia and a light cruiser Hobart, and the American cruiser Chicago, plus some escorting destroyers. They are operating in the area as a surface action group to, if they can come to grips with an enemy fleet, they might be able to knock off an invasion force. Meanwhile, he's got Task Force 17, Frank Fletcher's own force based around the Yorktown, and Task Force 11, which is task force based around the aircraft carrier Lexington. The American task forces tend to have 2 or 3 heavy cruisers and about 4 or 5 destroyers each. There's also a force with a couple of oilers and a couple of destroyers in the area. The Japanese have forces all over the place, like they always do. They've got the invasion force going down to Tulagi. They've got another invasion force headed around New Guinea to Port Moresby, and then they've got the carrier force. The sheer number of forces sailing around here and the various carrier admirals' misconceptions about where they're expecting to see the enemy turns this into an extremely confused battle. The only reason the two sides never sight each other is pure misfortune. With the number of ships sailing around the Coral Sea at this point, it's a miracle that 2 ships didn't randomly sail within sight of each other. And yet, it doesn't happen. The 2 forces come within 70 miles of each other and never know the other is there because they're looking in the wrong place. And at the end of the day, the forces never sight each other, the actual surface ships. And so this battle is massively historically significant because it's fought exclusively with carrier aircraft. So, the actual battle begins on the 7th. This is when both sides start putting out search aircraft. Search aircraft is interesting because it's very different between the 2 fleets. In the American fleet, the search aircraft are carrier planes, dive bombers. The SBD Dauntless, which is Scout and Bomber Dive, SBD, is used as a scouting plane and as a dive bomber. Each American carrier carries 2 18-aircraft squadrons, one that's nominally the Scout Squadron and one that's nominally the dive bombing squadron. And functionally, the aircraft are the same. You can use 2 dive bombing squadrons. They also have a squadron of fighters, approximately 18, and a squadron of torpedo bombers, again, approximately 18. The torpedo bombers at this point in the war are the Devastators, and these aircraft are relatively obsolete at this point. Their fighters are the F-4F Wildcats, and these aircraft are pretty good, but not quite up to snuff when compared with the Japanese Zero. The American pilots have had experience in their raids on the Japanese islands, but they're still nowhere near as good as the Japanese pilots. The Japanese, on the other hand, are using the excellent Zero as their fighter plane. They are using the Kate as their torpedo bomber. The Kate is a better aircraft than the Devastator. They also use Kates in the scouting role because of their extreme long range, but that's not their primary scout aircraft. They have the Val as the dive bomber. The Japanese don't use their carrier aircraft for scouting, primarily, as their doctrine goes. They use the float planes of their escorting cruisers to scout for the fleet. This means that none of your carrier strike aircraft are being wasted on scouting, because your scout aircraft, you send 24 out in all directions, and so you spot an enemy, well then you launch your strike. So none of these scout aircraft can be a part of the strike. The American carriers are essentially losing 1/4 of their aircraft from any given strike. American carriers tend to hold close to 100 aircraft, so they have bigger air groups, even though they're the same size compared to Japanese counterparts. However, the Japanese aren't typically wasting any of their aircraft on scouting. The Japanese even have a couple of scout cruisers that have all their guns up forward so that their fantails are purely, I won't call them flight decks because aircraft aren't taking off and landing from there, but are purely for aircraft handling. These cruisers tend to escort the Kido Butai, but Shokaku and Zuikaku, being detached from that, don't have any. So they're relying on their regular Japanese heavy cruisers, which have some scout aircraft and very good ones at that, but not enough. So for this battle, the Japanese end up using some of their carrier aircraft for scouting, and so that goes against their normal doctrine, and it reduces the size of their air groups, thankfully. So on the 7th, the Americans expect the Japanese to be to the north of them. The Japanese expect the Americans to be the south of them. In fact, they're basically on the same latitude, east-west of each other. And so the Americans are searching north, the Japanese are searching south. They never see the enemy's carriers. The American scout aircraft do find the Japanese invasion force, and that is being escorted by the light aircraft carrier Shoho. The Americans mistake her for a full fleet carrier, and they probably mistake some of the other ships in the force for carriers too, and so they launch a full strike to the north against this carrier. Shoho can only handle something like 18 aircraft, so she's not a significant player in this battle. The Japanese, on the other hand, searching to the south, don't see the American carriers, but they do see an American oiler being escorted by a destroyer. They mistake these ships for a cruiser and an aircraft carrier. Scouting plays a huge role in this battle and in the confused nature of this battle. The different admirals, Fletcher and Tanaka, are getting very incomplete information, and in some cases it's outright wrong. But it's interesting because they're hearing the wrong information from multiple sources. So, when 2 or 3 different scout aircraft see an enemy force and say that there's aircraft carriers there, you tend to think, oh, okay, that's got to be their main force, right? In actuality, spotting from the air while they're being attacked by combat air patrol in an area of ocean that's relatively overcast, so you're only seeing the enemy through breaks in the clouds, ends up being not particularly effective. The American attack on the Japanese force, they're able to attack the aircraft carrier Shoho, and they're able to do tremendous damage to her. She's not a full-size fleet carrier, and a full airstrike from both Yorktown and Lexington is able to attack her and destroy her outright. That's not a battle a light carrier can win. Likewise, the Japanese attack on Sims and Neosho is textbook. They get down there, and the attack aircraft realize that the scouts were wrong. These aren't our primary mission. And so they spend a lot of time searching themselves to try and find it. The Japanese aircraft have significantly bigger fuel tanks. Some of them can go over 1,000 miles, which is incredible for propeller-driven aircraft, carrier-based aircraft at this time. They can't find anything there. There's nothing else there. So eventually they start to run out of fuel. The torpedo bombers and the fighters return to the carriers with their ordnance. The torpedoes are massively expensive. The dive bombers decide to finish off the American ships. And this is maybe the most effective dive bombing attack in history. You've got some of the best trained guys in the world who have now been experienced through 6 months of combat. So something like 4 dive bombers attack the American destroyer. At least 3 of them hit Sims. She breaks in half, and it's something like only a dozen out of 200 crew members survive. Neosho is attacked by the rest of the dive bombers, and oilers aren't that fast moving, and they're pretty big and unmaneuverable, sure, but still, more than 10 bombs are able to hit her, which is ridiculous number. One aircraft is shot down and manages to kamikaze into her, although that term won't be invented for another 2 or 3 years. Just incredible accuracy on the part of these pilots. Really demonstrates how great they are. Problem is, they get home. They've just flown an all-day mission. They spent much longer out there than they were expecting because they were further searching. And at this point, Admiral Crace's cruisers have been discovered, and they're dangerously close to the Japanese invasion force, and somehow between the Japanese carriers and the invasion force. So Tanaka panics. He's got to protect the invasion force. That's his only reason for being here. And if there's American cruisers there, that may well be the carrier task force. his scouts just might have missed the carriers. So he decides he's going to launch an attack on them, even though that attack won't get home until after dark. He decides he's just going to send a picked group. He's not going to send his whole air group, just his very, very best. Well, some of his very, very best had just spent all day attacking Neosho and Sims. Doesn't matter. They are reloaded and launched immediately. So, Crace ends up being attacked by 2 waves of Japanese aircraft. They claim that Chicago is a California-class battleship and has been sunk, along with some other ships there. So Crace endures 2 attacks from them, and then a 3rd attack from MacArthur's B-17s, which mistake his ships for the Japanese invasion force. And Crace manages to do this without taking a single hit, even though everybody's claiming that they sank. The Americans are claiming they sank Japanese ships. The Japanese are claiming that they sank American battleships. Super confused battle. If I haven't highlighted that yet, super confused. Really hard to scout from the air. Anyway, Crace correctly loses his nerves. He's not getting air support. In fact, some of the planes that should probably be supporting him are attacking him. So he decides that he can't stay in this area without air support and starts to head back to the south. He has no idea where Fletcher is, who is his boss at this point, and Fletcher is maintaining radio silence, as you should do. If he sends out a radio signal, then the Japanese can find him. So Crace functionally doesn't take part in the battle from there on out. It was probably a waste on Fletcher's part to send a half a dozen ships that could have been part of his anti-aircraft screen out looking for the Japanese invasion force. But at the same time, he's trying to cover all bases. If something happens to his carriers, at least his surface ships have a chance. If his carriers are able to distract the Japanese carriers, maybe his surface ships can get in there. So you can decide for yourself if you think it was worthwhile for him to send them out there. Crace's ships do eat up some air attacks that might have otherwise gone at the U.S. fleet. And because the Japanese pilots are tired, about half of these planes go down. So some of the very best of the Japanese pilots at this point are not available for the next day when the carrier battle happens. So speaking of these pilots, they're exhausted. It's after dark, so they leave Crace and they see a pair of carriers. They start to circle like they're going to land on those carriers, and then those carriers start shooting at them. Turns out they're trying to land on the American fleet, which is not too far away from Crace's ships. So they finally found the American carriers. It's after dark and they've already spent their ordnance, so they hightailed out of there, managed to find their own carriers. Overnight, the various forces all reposition themselves, so spotting something in the late night doesn't mean that you'll be able to find them early the next morning. That's exactly when you put on more fuel and speed off in a different direction, change course, and then you're basically lost in the middle of the ocean again. The enemy can't find you. Admiral Tanaka does something interesting. He turns on his searchlights so that his aircraft can land, and most of the ones that have survived to this point are able to be recovered. This is very interesting because we see Spruance do the same thing during the Battle of the Philippine Sea. And it's a bold decision to make, because when you turn on your searchlights at night, anybody could find you. Enemy aircraft, enemy submarines, whatever the case is. So a pretty big deal that this guy was bold enough to do that to protect his own aircrew and get them back. And much like with Spruance 2 years later, it was the right move. He's able to recover his aircraft without being spotted. So, both sides know there's enemy carriers out there somewhere. And they both now sort of have an idea of where they are. They realize that they've been looking in the wrong place. So at 4:30 the next morning, each side launches search aircraft. The Japanese use some of their torpedo bombers to make a 360-degree search. The Americans have a decent idea of where they're looking, so they do a more directional search with their dive bombers. At basically the same time, both forces find each other. So each one launches a full strike. The Japanese strike has a good number of dive bombers, but not many torpedo bombers because they've used them for scouting, which isn't their normal role. And the American force has a good mix of dive bombers and torpedo bombers, but of course their scout aircraft aren't able to participate either. The Americans find the Japanese first. They are able to, I always get Shokaku and Zuikaku mixed up, but they're able to score hits on, I believe it's Shokaku, and Damager. Then the Japanese strike force finds the Americans. It's interesting, neither force at this point in the war has enough fighter planes. The Americans tend to have a single 18 aircraft squadron of fighters on each of their carriers. The Japanese tend to have 2 9-plane squadrons of fighters on their carriers. So they're each carrying roughly the same amount. But those fighters both have to form a combat air patrol that has aircraft in the air at all times, plus have reserve aircraft on the flight deck refueling to replace the ones in the air, plus have enough fighters to accompany your strike aircraft to protect them from combat air patrol when they reach the enemy's carriers. So both sides realize that they don't have enough fighters at this point. The American carriers and some of the cruisers have early radar, and these air search radar sets, CXAM and CXAM-1, have a range of maybe 50 miles under ideal conditions. 20 miles is more likely, but it means that the American fleet can use their radar to spot incoming enemy aircraft, use their radios to vector their combat air patrol towards those aircraft, and keep their escorts in a ring around their carriers to provide mutual anti-aircraft defense. The Japanese do not have this technology, so their escort ships, and it's interesting, Japanese carriers tend to have less escorts than American carriers. There's more of them, so they're less precious, I imagine. Whereas the American ships, these are a freaking hot commodity. We've only got a few of them. So the few Japanese ships tend to form a really wide arc around their carriers. So they can fire at American planes as they come in, but they aren't providing any sort of mutual escort force. Neither side ships have particularly great guns. The Japanese 5-inch guns don't track that great. The 25 millimeter is pretty abysmal. They use that in both the medium and light anti-aircraft role. The U.S. side, the 5-inch 38s are pretty good, but they're not as good as they're going to get. The 1.1-inch guns are pretty abysmal. They tend to jam all the time, and they have a mix of 20 millimeters and 50 cals, and those are okay at the close-in stuff, but they don't really have much stopping power. So the Japanese ships are out in advance of their carriers to spot the aircraft coming in, so that the carriers can then try and radio to their fighters. Radios were kind of an afterthought to the Zero. Heck, some pilots got rid of their radios because they didn't work so great and because they wanted to save weight so they could be more maneuverable. But yeah, it's kind of an afterthought that they don't really work that well. So using the radio to coordinate either from the carriers or within a squadron is very difficult, and using wing wagging or hand signals from the cockpit or flare pistols, you open up the cockpit and you fire a flare pistol out of your moving aircraft, is a more common way of signaling your squadron. And that is not particularly effective in a dogfight, as things are getting confused and planes are all over the place. So it means the Japanese combat air patrol can be very effective against the first wave that comes in, but subsequent waves, they're completely spent. We're going to talk more about this in the Midway video later. Meanwhile, on the American side, we are starting to learn how to use radar to pick up the enemy planes, have somebody coordinate our own fighters going out. Later on in the war, this will be an actual job. A fighter director will be an officer with his own radio equipment on the carrier or other ships, directing fighters towards flights of incoming aircraft that have been detected by radar. At this point, they're just learning that, hey, maybe we need more fighters and maybe we need a better way to coordinate them. So the Japanese strike is detected. The American Combat Air Patrol goes in. The fighters, about half of them are at the right altitude. The other half are flying kind of low, expecting Japanese torpedo bombers. Those are the big threats. You can put a bunch of holes in a flight deck and patch it with plywood and still be able to operate. You start punching holes in the side of your ship, and things don't go as well for you. You tend to not have a home to land on. So the Americans are expecting a lot of dangerous Japanese torpedo planes. Like I said, they've been used for scouting, so there were some, sure, but there weren't a huge amount. And about half of the American fighter planes are so low that they miss their intercept entirely. The Japanese planes fly right overhead and go on to attack the American carriers. The American carriers launched all their aircraft. If you have planes in your hangar, they tend to be able to blow up and do a lot of damage. Talk about that more at Midway too. But so the Americans launch all their aircraft. So a lot of their Dauntless dive bombers of the scouting squadrons, they actually throw up into the combat air defense role to supplement the small number of Wildcat fighters. The Dauntless is kind of slow, but it's pretty maneuverable. It's got 2 forward-facing machine guns at this point and a tail gun, which originally was a single gun. I think by this point they've got twin guns mounted in the tail gunner position. So, you know, they can get in there and mix it up. It works, I guess. They scramble up the Japanese formation. A bunch get shot down. A bunch of American dive bombers trying to be fighters get shot down, but they do more good there than they did on their flight decks or in their hangars. They can't have done too much good, though. We don't see this happen anymore after the Coral Sea. The Japanese see Yorktown and they attack her primarily with dive bombers. There's, I want to say, 4 torpedo bombers that break off and go after her, and they're able to put some dive bomb hits on her flight deck. Like I say, it's bad damage, but it can be patched. Lexington, the bigger of the 2 carriers, gets the full treatment with Japanese dive bombers and torpedo bombers. And they're able to do a perfect pincer with torpedo bombers coming in from both sides and dive bombers coming in from above at roughly the same time. So normally you would want to turn bow in towards a torpedo launch that gives you the narrowest possible profile and protects your very vulnerable rudders and propellers. With planes attacking from both sides and above, Lexington does her best, but the size of an Iowa-class battleship, 860 feet long at the waterline, with only a single rudder, the ship has a terrible turning radius and takes a number of bomb and torpedo hits. Even so, American damage control parties are pretty good and they're able to get the fires under control. The problem is one of the torpedoes hit an aviation gasoline storage compartment. The hit did enough damage that it ruptured interior bulkheads, so aviation gasoline fumes start to leak into the inside of Lexington. And they're not detected. Lexington has a ton of electric motors on board. She's a turbo-electric drive ship. And one of these motors sparks after the Japanese have already left and sets off the fumes, which causes a series of explosions that gut the inside of the ship and cause the American crew to have to abandon ship. The destroyer Phelps comes alongside and pumps something like 5 torpedoes into her side to sink her. So the U.S. have lost Lexington. Yorktown is functionally disabled. They decide, Fletcher thinks he's lost and decides to retreat. He's got to protect the carrier he has left. The Japanese, on the other hand, are also taking stock of the situation. They've lost more than half of their carrier aircraft. And Zuikaku, I'm pretty sure it's Zuikaku, is heavily damaged and has retreated from the fight. Shokaku was hidden in a rain squall at the time about 5 miles away, but doesn't have much in the way of a carrier air group. So they decide to postpone the invasion and withdraw themselves. Fletcher does hear that the Japanese are withdrawing, so he knows he hasn't fully lost. So he's now trying to get Yorktown home. At the end of the day, it looks like a Japanese victory. The Japanese have sunk more ships, but really, at the end of the day, it's a Japanese tactical victory. They have sunk more ships. It's a strategic victory for the Allies, though. They have prevented the invasion of Port Moresby. The Japanese will never try an amphibious invasion there again. They'll try to go over the Owen Stanley mountain range through the Kokoda Trail. And they'll run into some absolutely freaking crazy Anzacs along the trail, Australia New Zealand Army Corps. And about a year of bitter fighting going back and forth in these mountain ranges will result in the Japanese not being able to take Port Moresby and isolate the Australians. The Battle of Coral Sea is the first Japanese attack that is stopped. It also results in Shokaku and Zuikaku not being able to participate in the Midway operation. Zuikaku is damaged to the point that she can't participate. Shokaku has lost enough aircraft that the Japanese don't want to send her out. For whatever reason, the Japanese had stopped production of Vals and Kates at this point in the war, and so there wasn't a ready supply of aircraft to refill her hangars. Theoretically, they could have taken the leftover aircraft from Zuikaku and formed a single air group, but that wasn't Japanese doctrine. Japanese doctrine was that the carrier aircraft and the carrier were one unit, so you don't swap them around. American carrier doctrine was that the squadrons were completely interchangeable, so you could take them from carrier to carrier to carrier. We'll talk about this more in the Midway episode as well, but the Americans are able to take the damaged Saratoga's air group and plug it in on Yorktown, which Sarah group has been deteriorated, and so Yorktown is 100% battle ready. On the other hand, the Japanese have the opportunity to do this, but it goes against their doctrine, and so they don't. And so they don't have overwhelming superiority at Midway. Finally, the last piece here, Halsey finally shows up in the Coral Sea a little bit later. He's missed the battle. The Japanese have already pulled back. He's got no reason for being there with Enterprise and Hornet. Nimitz radios to him and says, hey, make sure the Japanese see you're there. So he does. The Japanese believe that they have sunk both Lexington and Yorktown. They claim it's Saratoga and Yorktown, but whatever. And the battleship California. So when they see two perfectly good American aircraft carriers sailing around the Coral Sea, they believe that there is the rest of the American carrier force. And they're right. As soon as Halsey is spotted, though, he hightails it back to Pearl Harbor so that Nimitz can reposition him along with Yorktown for the Midway operation. The Japanese assume that all of the remaining American carriers are in the South Pacific, so that when they launch their North Pacific attack on Midway in June, they're expecting to catch Midway Island undefended, and then they're expecting they'll be able to take the island and wait a day or two for the American carriers to come all the way back up from the south. Their spotting reports from around there indicate that the American carriers are there. You know how object permanence is. If that's the last place I saw them, they've got to still be there, right? So this allows the American carriers at Midway to ambush the Japanese. So Coral Sea is hugely significant to the Allies. It ends up being a much larger strategic victory than anybody at the time certainly was able to predict. The Battle of the Coral Sea proves that carriers are capital ships unto themselves that are able to fight engagements without needing surface vessels to engage the enemy. all major battles from here on out are going to revolve around the carriers. Whether the carriers are involved or not. In the battles from here on out where there aren't carriers, people are still worrying that there are going to be carriers. So say that the various battles around Leyte Gulf, where the Japanese don't have any functional carriers, they're very much deploying with carriers in mind, trying to do things at night. So the Battle of the Coral Sea is really where naval warfare changes. Up until this point, May of 1942, there has been no proof that carrier aircraft were powerful enough, large enough, modern enough to be able to carry weapons large enough at long enough range to be able to attack enemy ships on their own. Up until now, it had been assumed that carriers attached to a battle fleet could do some damage to an enemy fleet that might give you an edge when you bring your own battle fleet in to fight them, but they weren't any sort of significant factor. Well, now they're the queens of the seas. It has been proven. And then we're only going to see that time and time again at Midway, in the various carrier battles around the Solomon Seas, and then later in the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf. Who knows what the Queen of the Seas is today? There hasn't been a carrier battle since 1944. Do you think the Battle of the Coral Sea is historically significant? Do you think it's the most historically significant? Let us know in the comment section down below which naval battle is the most historically significant in history. It doesn't necessarily have to be a World War II battle. Battleship New Jersey receives operating support from the New Jersey Department of State, and also from viewers like you and private businesses. But in particular, it's the support from viewers like you that has allowed us to making YouTube videos a larger part of what we do. It allows us to put out several videos a week. If you'd like to support us, remember that there's a link in the description for ways you can donate. And also, you can like, share, and subscribe. That helps us, and it will also let you know when all those new videos go live. Thanks for watching.